$16,000. That's what it costs to sit in the best seat at the 2026 World Cup final. Not a private box, one seat, one match, $16,000. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. When the United States, Canada, and Mexico won the right to host this tournament, they made a promise. The most expensive seat at the final would cost $1,550. That was the deal. That was written down. So how did a $1,500 promise become a $16,000 reality? And why is FIFA, the organization that runs world football, now being investigated by 2 American attorneys general? This isn't really a story about expensive tickets. It's the story of how the people who govern football quietly decided that fans were the product. And by the end, you'll watch it backfire on them, live, on opening day, in front of the entire world. To understand how this happened, you have to understand one number that changed everything: dynamic pricing. For decades, a World Cup ticket had a fixed price. You knew what a seat cost. Rich or poor, the number on the ticket was the same. But for 2026, FIFA changed the rules. They borrowed a trick from the airlines and the concert giants, the same system that makes a flight cost triple the day everyone wants to fly. The more people wanted a seat, the higher the price climbed. Automatically, endlessly. The bigger your dream of being there, the more it would cost you to live it. Demand wasn't something FIFA tried to satisfy. Demand was something FIFA learned to charge for. And the prices didn't creep. They exploded. A seat at the final that started at around $6,500 climbed to nearly $11,000 in a matter of weeks. And even the cheapest seats followed it up. Compared to the last World Cup in Qatar, some prices had jumped nearly 10 times over. 10 times in 4 years. Now here's where the story turns. Because if FIFA were just a business, you could shrug and say, that's capitalism. A company charges what people will pay. But FIFA is not a normal company. FIFA is, on paper, a non-profit. A registered association under Swiss law whose stated purpose is to serve football. Not shareholders, not investors, football. The money is supposed to flow back into the game, into tournaments, into developing the sport, into the federations that run it in every country on earth. That is the entire justification for FIFA's existence. That is why it answers to no government and pays barely any tax. So ask yourself the obvious question. If FIFA is a non-profit built for the good of the game, why is it squeezing $16,000 out of a single supporter? Follow the money and it gets darker. Across this World Cup cycle, FIFA is on track to bring in around $13 billion. $13 billion from an organization that calls itself a charity for sport. And while ordinary fans were being priced out of the stadium, the man at the top was doing just fine. FIFA's president, Gianni Infantino, was handed a 33% pay rise, lifting his package to more than $4.5 million a year. A non-profit for the good of the game, a $13 billion haul, and a president who keeps giving himself a raise. One commenter said it better than any journalist. Infantino makes his disgraced predecessor look good. If you're already seeing FIFA in a new light, subscribe. Digging up what football's powerful would rather keep buried is the whole point of this channel. And it gets worse, because this didn't stay a story about angry fans online. It became a legal problem. The Attorneys General of New York and New Jersey, 2 of the states hosting the tournament, including the state hosting the final itself, opened an investigation into FIFA's ticketing. The allegations are damning, artificially inflating prices and misleading fans about the seats they were actually buying. Over in Europe, consumer groups launched their own complaint over the same dynamic pricing. So how did FIFA respond to a global backlash and a legal investigation? With a gesture. They announced cut-price tickets, $60 seats for a team's most loyal supporters. It sounded generous, until you read the small print. Those cheap seats made up around 10% of each country's allocation, a few hundred seats, in stadiums that hold 80,000 people. It wasn't a solution, it was a photograph, something to point at while the real prices stayed exactly where they were. So here's the question I want you to drop in the comments before we reach the ending. If an organization calls itself non-profit, takes in $13 billion, and prices its own fans out of the game they built, is that still football's governing body? Or is it just a corporation wearing football's badge? Tell me where you land, because the ending is where FIFA's plan finally met reality. For all the billions, for all the dynamic pricing, the tournament arrived carrying a quiet secret. The seats weren't selling. Before a single ball was kicked, only a fraction of the matches had actually sold out. Tickets for dozens of games were still sitting unsold on FIFA's own website in the final hours before kickoff. Because the people who wanted to be there simply couldn't afford to be. And then the cameras turned on. At Canada's opening match, more than 1,000 seats sat empty in a stadium that barely holds 44,000. In Guadalajara, patches of bare red seats scattered across the stands on the opening day of a home World Cup, in one of the most football-mad countries on earth. The most valuable event in sport, and the broadcast kept cutting to rows of nobody. That is what greed looks like when it finally overreaches. FIFA tried to charge fans as if every seat were priceless, and ended up with stadiums that couldn't be filled. They were so determined not to leave money on the table that they left the seats themselves empty. The whole world watched football's governing body price out the very people football belongs to. $16,000 for one seat. A promise of $1,500 broken. A non-profit that made billions. And a World Cup that, on its biggest stage, couldn't sell its own tickets. This was never really about the price of a ticket. It was about who the World Cup is for. And in 2026, FIFA gave us the answer, written in rows of empty seats. If this is the FIFA you suspected was there all along, then you need to see how deep the rot actually goes. Because the next story is about the scandal that put football officials in handcuffs. That one's coming next. Watch it and decide for yourself just how corrupt the beautiful game has become.